Hey, yeah, thank you, Florian, for your introduction. And I'm happy to present indeed to introduce, to kick off the roundtable with the introduction, and within the introduction to tell a little bit about the work that we have been doing under the Permagov project. And after my part, Vrouwtje will follow with explaining a little bit more about what the results are within the CrossGov project. As a general introduction, Turian already referred to it. Both projects look at the developments in the EU Green Deal and the developments around marine governance and how the EU Green Deal is changing governing activities at sea and impacts on the marine environment. And the EU Green Deal is, of course, an ambitious set or vision. Actually, it starts with a future vision for the European society. It's ambitious in nature, and although it's focused on the EU society, it of course also has implications and deals with issues around the marine environment and activities that impact the marine environment. So just a couple of examples of the types of ambitious targets that are set under the EU Green Deal. There are, of course, the climate targets. Those are very much prominent in this future vision. But to achieve those climate targets, there are concrete targets to expand offshore wind capacity from 12 gigawatt to 60 gigawatt to 300 gigawatt by 2050, for example. In addition, there are some targets around creating a network of protected areas, not just on land, but also at sea, which should cover 30% of spatially. But there are also, of course, targets around protecting birds and habitats. So there are different targets, and today we will discuss more of them. But the point is they are ambitious, and in order to achieve such ambitious targets, both projects, Permagov and CrossGov, work with or depart from the fact that in order to achieve and implement measures to achieve these objectives, marine governance itself needs to innovate, it needs to change, it needs to improve, it needs to be able to actually set those measures and achieve and implement them to achieve EU Green Deal targets. So part of that is to improve collaboration, to improve the coherence of within marine governance, especially across different sectors and different issue areas like wind energy and biodiversity, to integrate activities and policy making for different issue areas, so that there is a possibility to achieve those targets. Now, this is not easy. Marine governance, of course, is not something that comes out of nowhere. There are already institutionalized, as we call them, or routinized practices of collaboration, of decision making, of implementation. So changing that in a relatively short time span that the Green Deal has put in place with targets for 2030 and then 2050, that's quite a challenge. We also recognize that there are institutional barriers, as we call them. So those are barriers that come from different rules, procedures, both formal and informal, certain norms that already exist about collaboration, about which issue areas are more or less dealt with separately, or where collaboration already has emerged. We need to better understand these barriers, but we also need to look at how coherent policy making has been in the past, because a lot of the EU Green Deal relies on existing directives and regulation that the EU already has put in place, which are currently being amended and revised, and keeping or ensuring that these developments happen in a coherent way, so that there's no disjointed between different issue areas is also important. So that's the starting point for both projects, which are funded, of course, by the Horizon Europe program. I will now continue to tell a little bit more about tool that we have developed as part of the Permagov project, and it's a tool, we call it the diagnostic tool, to identify and to show how institutional barriers emerge. We call it a simple diagnostic tool. I will come with a disclaimer immediately after explaining the basis of a diagnostic tool, because it's not simple. You can find the report in which we introduced the diagnostic tool, or especially how we developed it on the Permagov website. So I've added a link here. And the aim is to help both researchers but also practitioners to identify how governance issues and institutional barriers are linked to what we call institutional attributes. And institutional attributes are basically characteristics, governance characteristics that emerge out of these institutions, so the rules and procedures in place. And we have three types of institutional attributes. So we have institutional attributes around the characteristic of the institutions in terms of, for example, at which scale they are, at the EU scale or more nationally, how rigid they are, how formal they are, and what kind of incentives for participation they create. And then we move into the second category that are about these incentives for participation from different actors and stakeholders. So there are specific rules and procedures around eligibility of actors to participate, different roles and responsibilities they have, what kind of resources they have, and what kind of power and control they have over decision-making processes, accountability of actors, and the connectivity between actors. And then we have a third set of institutional attributes around more procedural, also in nature, when it comes to conflict management and development and use of knowledge. So a wide variety of potential institutional attributes or existing institutional attributes that of course are changing now also under the EU Green Deal, that already makes it more complex. But the idea is that identifying these attributes can help to also identify the barriers and undesired governance outcomes, for example, lack of institutional integration or policy incoherence. So it's not just the attributes that are important. Actually, what we have observed is that different attributes can become barriers. And this is where it becomes more complex, because some attributes will be perceived as a barrier, but some will actually act as an enabler or are just there. And so when an institutional attribute actually becomes an institutional barrier, that's more difficult to say. And then what kind of governance effect those barriers have, and how it becomes undesirable in order to achieve the EU Green Deal objectives, but also to prevent change within marine governance. That's another step in sort of identifying how institutional barriers lead to undesirable governance effects. So we work with these three components, and to make it then even more complex, what we've also observed is that resolving one barrier can tackle multiple governance issues. So there's also there are relationships between institutional attributes and barriers and how they lead to governance issues. So it's not one institutional attribute or one institutional barrier that sort of prevents institutional change and integration to happen. It's actually multiple together. So it's a complexity of different attributes, barriers, and therefore undesirable governance effects or outcomes, or at least lack of progress, you could say. So that leads me to how to use the diagnostic tool. We will, of course, use it in the project. We are currently using it to identify the institutional barriers within different domains. One is marine energy and one is marine life. We have different case studies within the 4 issue areas that we focus on. So that's pending, that's a future outcome. But like I said, we also hope the diagnostic tool can be helpful for practitioners, for policymakers. that means that it's not about only identifying, but also assessing the impact of these barriers. What is the governance outcome or the hampering effect? What is the barrier? Why is the barrier? And to what extent is it a priority to achieve the Green Deal objectives, for example, around offshore energy and protecting marine biodiversity, but also recognizing these interconnections. So it's more than just recognizing the institutional attributes. It's also what impact they create and how multiple barriers actually may reinforce each other. This then requires more in-depth knowledge of governance dynamics and institutional attributes. And that means that people, if you use this diagnostic tool, also for us within the project, we need to go deeper, and we need to, which also takes time. We need to talk to different stakeholders. So also in using the diagnostic tool, I think it's not something you can do on your own. It has to be part of a collaborative process, actually, with different perceptions and input that together can then help reflect on the governance dynamics that currently are going on and how that's changing and how that's linked to institutional attributes, sometimes some of which are already long in place. And it also requires doing this every now and then. So the continuously refers to the fact that this is, of course, there are always changes going on. So that means that you do it once and you react to what your outcome, you can resolve some things, but then new barriers can, of course, emerge again. So yeah, that's a little bit of insight into the first tool that we have developed, and the applications to come. So watch out for that. And I hope that today we can discuss already some of these institutional barriers when related to marine energy and biodiversity.